The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Foundation podcast with Andy Duncan, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Hello and welcome to another Gold Money Foundation podcast at the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. This afternoon I'm speaking to Matthew McCaffery. He's a PhD student at the University of Angers under Professor Guido Hülsmann. He's also the editor of Libertarian Papers. Now, he was speaking today because he's contributed a chapter to the recent centenary book on a theory of money and credit, which was released by the Mises Institute. Hello, Matthew.
Hello, Andy.
Fantastic. Can you tell us about your chapter in the book?
Well, my contribution to this volume is a celebration of the 100th anniversary of Mises, Ludwig van Mises' first great book, The Theory of Money and Credit. And my chapter is a sort of an historical appreciation of Mises' work. What I do is I sort of look at some of the British influences on Mises' monetary theory. Particularly, I look at Mises' work in light of two 19th century British schools of thought, the currency school and the banking school. And basically what I try to show is that Mises was essentially an adherent of the currency school tradition and a great opponent of the banking school tradition. That comes through very much in his works. And further in my chapter, I compare Mises and his British heritage in monetary theory to the work of two other economists, young Viennese economists who published important treatises on money and banking at around the same time as Mises, Joseph Schumpeter and Rudolf Hilferding. And their work, too, is a reflection of these earlier British debates on monetary theory.
Yeah. This Rudolf Hilferding, it sounds a bit frightening. He was an Austro Marxist. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, well, the Rudolf Hilferding was indeed a member of the Austro Marxist school. This is a very sort of odd branch of economic and political thought. The Austro Marxists, as the name implies, they were indeed a type of Marxist, and they grew up around Vienna, mostly in the decades after the turn of the century. And they had a very sort of odd approach to Marxism, and especially some very unconventional influences on their Marxist thought, for example, like logical positivism, but also they were influenced to some extent by the thinking of the Austrians at the time, especially Böhm-Bawerk.
Yeah, Joseph Schumpeter produced a book in 1911. Now, he's one of my favourite people because he comes up with the phrase creative destructionism. But although he was from Austria, he wasn't strictly an Austrian in the kind of Karl Mengerian tradition. Do you think Mises wrote his 1912 book, A Theory of Money and Credit, as a response to Schumpeter in some way?
Well, this is actually a very interesting question. In a direct sense, no. I mean, Mises' work does stand on its own, and it does indeed have its own unique aspects. But it is very, very much the case that Mises and Schumpeter were trying to address very similar questions, and in a sense were addressing each other to some extent as well through their works. For example, Schumpeter's first book, which appeared in, I believe, 1908, did actually have some things to say about the topics of money that Mises directly addresses in the Theory of Money and Credit. And Schumpeter, of course, does discuss monetary issues in the Theory of Economic Development as well, but Mises didn't address those so much in his book.
Yeah. Now, the book has been edited by Guido Hülsmann, who's not here at this conference, although I spoke to him in a podcast Gold Money thing a while ago. What chapters in his book do you also like, beside your own, of course?
Well, there are a few very interesting ones. One that comes to mind is a chapter by Mateusz Machaj, who was a Polish economist, and he discusses Mises' innovations in the theory of money and credit as far as value theory are concerned. I think the theory of money and credit is justly known as a text that one of its fundamental contributions is the integration of the Austrian, the Mengerian theory of value with the theory of money. And Mihai, in his essay, explores that and explains just why and how Mises was such an innovator in terms of value theory, both with regard to money and also with regard to sort of broader issues that I think economists are familiar with. For example, the idea of making interpersonal comparisons of utility. This was an idea that Mises developed more later in his life, but again, the seeds were sown already in 1912. And Mihai talks about Mises' originality in this regard, and also compares him to other contemporary economists on these value problems, like Irving Fisher, for example.
Yeah. Now, most people who've heard of Mises have heard of Human Action, which is kind of said to be his magnum opus. Although my personal favourite book of his was Socialism. But some people say that The Theory of Money and Credit was the key, pivotal, central book and the most important one he wrote. What are your opinions on the importance of A Theory of Money and Credit?
Well, it would be very difficult to overstate the importance of Theory of Money and Credit, I would say. One of the themes that comes out in this collection to celebrate that book is that a lot of the great ideas that Mises fully developed later in books like Socialism and Human Action he had clearly already been thinking about them to some extent in this early work. And you can really see, I think, when you read it, that the later ideas that we're more familiar with were in fact built on this earlier work. And especially in terms of his interaction with the older Austrians like Menger and Böhm-Bawerk, whose work he adapted and built on and improved.
Yeah. It's great that you've done a chapter in this book along with several other people like Torsten Polleit and a few others. Do you have any other projects that you're working on at the moment?
At the moment, I'm finishing my PhD dissertation, of course, which is on the theory of moral hazard, which I've also been talking about at this conference. And in addition, I do a lot of work on the economics of entrepreneurship, particularly in extending and applying the Austrian notion of the entrepreneur to these areas, like, for example, the theory of moral hazard, where typically they are neglected by mainstream economists.
Okay. Well, it's been a great pleasure speaking to you today, Matthew, and it's great listening to your speech today. Thank you for coming on the Gold Money Foundation podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Subscribe to the Gold Money newsletter at www.goldmoney.com to receive email updates on new articles, videos, and iTunes podcasts from our Gold Research section.